More than 48 hours after the rocket strike which hit the Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital in Gaza, there is still confusion over who done it. There is some evidence which is available in the public domain. Both CNN and BBC have done separate investigations into who was behind the hospital strike. There are conflicting claims. Hamas says it was Israel with one of its famous airstrikes. The Israeli Defense Forces claim it was a Palestinian terrorist rocket which misfired and struck the hospital, which they have now attributed as the handiwork of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terror group. So what have the CNN and BBC pieces found? What does the evidence suggest? And is it conclusive in any one direction or the other? This is what the CNN investigation into the hospital strike has found out. They have spoken to US intelligence leadership, and this is what they are inclined to believe bases their own assessments, independent of what Israel is claiming. The US government currently assesses that Israel was not responsible for the blast, according to the US National Security Council, the NSC. President Joe Biden, who was making a high-stakes visit to Israel just a day after this hospital blast, told Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that the damage at the hospital appears as though it was done by the other team, not you. But there's a lot of people out there who are not sure, so we've got to overcome a lot of things, Biden added. The National Security Council has come to this assessment, according to CNN. Intelligence indicates that some Palestinian militants in the Gaza Strip believed that the explosion was likely caused by an errant rocket or missile launch that was carried out by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, or the PIJ. The militants were still investigating what had happened. This, according to the NSC spokesperson, Adrian Watson. American intelligence officials also told CNN that the initial evidence gathered by the US intelligence community suggests that the hospital strike came from a rocket launched by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and not from an Israeli airstrike. Now, among the evidence that they have looked at is a blast analysis which suggests that this was a ground explosion rather than an airstrike that hit the hospital. There was no single big crater that was wider than 3 meters in the aftermath of this attack, which suggests that there
Every adventurer needs a trusted buddy.
There was a bomb or an airstrike from air to ground through a missile. Rather, it was from the ground. There was extensive fire damage, there was scattered debris, which seems to be consistent with an explosion that starts from the ground level up and not from the air to the ground. Now, that analysis is just one data point which has led intelligence officials to incline towards their assessment that the attack on the hospital was a rocket launch gone wrong. Similarly, a BBC report tried to find out who was behind the blast, looking at video footage, still imagery, and other evidence, including eyewitness accounts. In addition, a BBC journalist also got access to the blast site in northern Gaza, where there is limited access. The explosion at the hospital happened around 1900 local time on Tuesday night. A 20-second video which circulated on social media showed that the blast was the first significant piece of visual evidence to emerge after the incident. Now, if you look at that video, you can hear the sound of a rocket, almost like a whistling sound, followed by an explosion and then a huge fire. Then there was live footage from the Al Jazeera channel, which aired at 18:59 local time, just a minute before the bombs went off, which showed a bright light rising in the skies above Gaza. It flashes twice in the sky, and then it drastically changes direction and then finally explodes. All of this happens in a matter of seconds. An explosion is then seen far away on the ground. Now, some commentators have looked at this footage and have suggested this is likely from a rocket which appears to have changed direction, exploded, or disintegrated, and then this huge ball of fire. Now, the BBC in this report claims it contacted 20 different experts, think tanks, universities, companies who have weapons expertise. 9 of them did not respond. 5 of them did not comment at all, or at least were not willing to come on record to comment. But 6 of them spoke to the BBC, but so far, out of these 6, the findings are inconclusive. 3 experts said it is not consistent with what you would expect from a typical Israeli airstrike. Now, one expert who spoke to the BBC and he's been quoted in this report, he says the ground explosions appeared to be small, meaning that the heat generated from the impact may have been caused by leftover rocket fuel rather than an explosion from a warhead which is mounted onto a missile. Another expert said the evidence looks like the explosion was caused by a failed rocket part hitting the car park and then causing a fire and a small hole on the ground. Based on available evidence, it appears that the explosion happened in a courtyard or a car park, which is part of the wider hospital complex, but not the hospital building itself. In fact, if you look at some of the images on the ground after the blast, it does not show any significant damage to surrounding buildings. What those images show instead are scorch marks, it shows burnt out cars, and of course a very, very small hole, perhaps about a meter or so. One of the most critical pieces of evidence is the nature of the crater that is left behind by this explosion. The IDF says the absence of a large crater, that's 3 meters or wider than that, or blast damage to the adjacent buildings. Remember, no structural damage has happened to any of the buildings nearby this hospital. Now, the IDF is using these 2 bits of evidence, the lack of a big crater and the lack of structural damage to nearby buildings. The IDF is claiming that the explosion was not caused by its weapons, because likely if they were using heavy-duty weapons, then there would be both of this, a crater wider than 3 meters, as well as structural damage to nearby buildings. Another very important part of the missing evidence is missile fragments. Now, normally, when rockets are fired, either intentionally or if they crash inadvertently, they are often identifiable by the wreckage that they leave behind, the kind of shell and the shrapnel that you will see all around. That can be then used to determine what kind of rocket it was, who likely fired that rocket, and from where. But in this case, the BBC report says they have not seen, at least from the pictures that are available on open source, they have not seen any wreckage or any fragments or shrapnel left behind by the rocket. Now, it's also important to note that as well as the physical fighting that's been going on for the better part of the last almost 2 weeks now between Israel and Hamas, this conflict is also playing out as an information war on the internet. This is not the first time that authorities in Israel or Gaza have given completely different accounts of an explosion. And sadly, it may not be the last. What is being missed in the fog of war is authentic, reliable, and some would say conclusive information.